And let's say I'm on my home page and I would like to view this question about how to build a Quora clone in Bubble. I could select this, and this would now redirect us through to our question page. And then I could choose to add in an answer of my own. Hello, my name is Lachlan Kirkwood, and today I'll be teaching you how to build a question and answer platform like Quora entirely out of no-code using Bubble. Bubble is by far one of my favorite no-code tools, and in my opinion, it's one of the most powerful no-code tools. It gives you the ability to create your own custom database, as well as complete control over the design of your application, the workflows that power it, and also the ability to integrate with third-party tools and extensions. For those of you who don't know me, I've spent the past year working alongside the Bubble team to help write their How to Build blog series. This series took a list of the top products out there on the market, like Airbnb, Uber, and Instagram, and explained the step-by-step instructions to rebuilding each platform with no code using Bubble's own tool. After receiving plenty of requests from the no-code community, I've decided to create my own video series to walk you through the process in more detail. Of course, I would just like to note that this video series has no affiliation with Bubble, and it's something I'm doing within my own time. Within today's tutorial, I'll be walking you through the process of creating your own Quora clone application. This will include features like being able to register user accounts, creating a home page to display a list of questions, as well as a search experience for users to easily discover questions, building a feature where users can submit answers to questions, as well as another feature where users can upvote and downvote responses to questions. We'll also be building a feature to display a user profile page across our application, as well as, of course, build out the feature to create Quora spaces within our application. And then finally, I'll also be explaining how we can create posts and comments within those Quora spaces. There is a few little complexities within this build, but I'll be explaining everything in as much detail as we walk through it. So grab your Bubble editor and let's get started. The first feature we'll be building out today isn't actually a core user-facing feature within our application. Instead, we're going to take the time to set up and configure the necessary data types and data fields within our custom Bubble database. And this is one of the core features that I really love within Bubble because it gives you the complete control over creating your own custom experience that can shape the overall performance of your application. Now, throughout my tutorial today, you'll notice that I'm going to be referencing this list here that I've created within Notion. I personally just use Notion to keep a checklist of all the data types, the data fields, and then all of the features that we'll be adding into our build today. And what I love about Notion is that you can simply just check off each item once you've finished adding that into the Bubble editor. If you don't have a Notion account, I'd recommend creating one. It's free to do. And that way you can create your own checklist and follow along as we put our build together. But as I mentioned, we're first going to start by configuring the database for our Quora clone application today. So if we head into our Bubble editor here and open up the data tab, you'll first notice that the user data type already exists within our database. And the reason this is an existing data type is because, of course, you need to create a user account whenever someone would like to register for your application. And by default, this field will automatically come with an email and password data field. As you can see, the emailed field already exists here. The password field does also exist, but you just won't be able to see that within your database for security reasons. One thing I would just like to note though before we take the time to build out our database is that by default, Bubble will also add some privacy rules to the user data type in your application. So right here, you can see that it says that the privacy rules have been applied. And if we click into that, it will just take you through to a privacy menu that explains the default settings that Bubble has added to the user data type. Essentially, in plain terms, what this means is that if a user was to create something within your application, So for our example today, let's say a user was to create a question on our Quora platform and they were to publish that. At the moment with this current user privacy setting, the person who created that question is the only person who can view that question. And that is not the experience we want to create. We want to create an experience where a user can publish a question to our application and then every other user on the platform can see that. So what we'll need to do is actually delete this privacy setting. And now that will help us create a public experience that we need to replicate within our Quora product. One thing I will also just note is that if you jump over to the data types tab again, you can now see that our user data type is publicly visible. But when you're to create a new data type, you'll just need to double check that this box here isn't ticked. So when this box is selected, it adds the same privacy rules that we had just deleted from our user data type onto any new data type you create. And that is not the experience we want to replicate. So I'm going to unselect that and make sure that that is unselected at any time that I create a new data type. Because if this is selected, what you'll find is that once you finish building your application and you decide to preview it, when you load your app, all the elements and components on your page will load, but you just won't have any data displayed, and that is because of the privacy rules. So I just wanted to take the time now to highlight how these can actually affect your Bubble application when you preview it, if you just don't take the necessary time to understand what the privacy rules are that Bubble applies. But let's jump back into our Notion doc now, and we can start to run through all the different data types and fields we'll be adding into our application today. I have a few different data types that I'll be adding into the app. And the first one is a list of option sets, which I'll be explaining to you in a moment in more detail. But essentially the main data types I'll be registering today is a user. So for every user that registers an account, I obviously want to store some information about them. And then I will have a question data type. So when a user would like to publish a question in our application, we can create a new question within our database. And then for every question, of course, I would also like to allow users to create answers to those questions. So when a user submits an answer to a question, we will be linking that back to an original question that they have decided to answer. I'll be explaining that in more detail when we actually add that into our database. But one thing you might notice here is that I have two different data types for our answers. One is just the answer itself, and the other is called the answer content. And now the reason I have two data types here, even though they are both for our answer, is to help streamline the speed of our application. So for every answer, we're going to need to link this back to an original question. But within that, I'm also going to want to store a list of upvotes and downvotes on that question. That's fine. But what you will notice is that for the answer content, I've actually split out the text, so the content, that will be published for this answer. So let's say someone submits an answer to a question. The response within that answer, so the details that they're adding, will actually be stored under our answer content. And the reason I'm doing this is because I mentioned it will help speed up our application. So within Bubble, every time you load a list of answers, it will load all of the data fields that sit within that. And so let's say we would like to load 10 different answers. It will load all of these relevant fields within it as well. And if we had the content field, which can often be long form text, particularly on Quora, if you're giving a really detailed answer to a question, if this data field sat under our answer data type, that would mean that when we're loading 10 different answers, it would have to load 10 different responses as well, which, as I mentioned, when it's long form text, can quickly slow your application down because the Bubble editor is having to load a lot of content. So what I personally like to do, and I'll be explaining this to you in more detail when we actually add these into our database, is split the answer content separate from our answer. And then I also like to link the answer content back to an original answer. So that way when we would like to display the actual content that's been added into an answer, we can easily just reference this and connect it back to the original answer. Now I know this might sound quite confusing, particularly if you are new to Bubble, But I really just wanted to take the time to explain how you need to correctly structure your database in order to optimize for speed within your application. Following on from our answer data types though, we have the space data type. Now, if you're not familiar with spaces within Quora, they are just like the equivalent of a Facebook group within Quora. It's kind of just like a community you can create, and then people can publish posts within them. So they don't really publish questions, but more just kind of posts that members can comment on. So essentially a Quora space will just be like a Facebook group. And then within each Quora space, so within each group, I would also like to register a list of posts that members can publish within that space. So right now I have a separate data type called spaced posts. And so every single time a post is created within a Quora space, I would like to register that in my database. And once again, you will see that I have split the content of each post separate from the post itself. Meaning that because Quora space posts can sometimes be quite long within a group, so I just want to separate those into different data types, so we only need to load the content of the post whenever it's necessary. And then finally, I would also just like to register comments within a space post. And that is just, of course, a way for users to add interactions onto any posts that are published within a group. But let's go and now take the time to add all of these within our database. I'm going to explain every single data field as I walk through it, just so you have a complete understanding of what you will need to create within the application. Now, the first thing I would like to add to my database isn't actually the data types I just explained. Instead, I'm going to add what's called a list of option sets. Now, if you're new to Bubble, you might not have heard of option sets yet, but if we open up our Bubble editor here, you'll see that under our data tab here, we have a data types menu option, and this is where we'll be adding in all of our data types today. But over to the right hand side here, we also have a menu item called option sets. And now if I open this, you'll find that it looks somewhat the same as a data type. And the difference between an option set and a data type is that a data type is used whenever you would like to create something within your application. So let's say back to my example before where I mentioned I was creating a data type for questions that are published in our application. The way I view data types is that if you want a user to create something in your app, you should add that as a data type. So if a user is creating a question, if they're creating an answer, or if they're even creating a Quora space, these are all things that users should and will be able to create and publish within your application. So they will all be data types. But if there's something that you just want users to reference, not particularly create, this is where option sets can come in handy. So the list of option sets that I'll be adding in today is what's called the list of categories within Quora. And this is essentially just a list of categories that users can select that they're interested in. And of course, we can use these later on in our build to filter particular posts by a user's interests. But the reason I'll be adding these as a list of option sets is because I don't want users to actually be able to create categories. I, as the admin of this application, want to create the categories myself and then allow the users to select from them. And that's where option sets can come in handy. So with option sets, once I add these in as a list of options, I can reference these at any given time throughout my application. So let's say if a user is registering an account and I would like them to add in a list of categories that they're interested in, I can use something like a drop-down element to then reference all of the categories that I've added in my option set list. Whereas if I had a list of categories as a data type, it would encourage users to create their own categories of interest, which is not the experience I want, because some users might add typos into the categories that they're interested in, or they might even add duplicates. Whereas if I add in a list of option sets, I'm in complete control of those, and the users will have to choose from the list that I've added. So I'm going to open up our option sets here, and I'll be calling our first option set categories. I will create that. And now by default, you'll see that the option set has added in what's called an attribute. And so an attribute is kind of like a data field in that it allows you to just store any particular information within this option set we've just created. For our tutorial today, we will only just need to use the default attribute, which is called the display. And the display is actually just the name of every single category that we're going to add. And so I'll be adding in our first list of options today, and this will be called tech. That's a category that users could list that they're interested in. And then I will add in a few other options. So I'm going to say startups, I'll create that, marketing, and design. And now all of the options here are a list of displays. And as I mentioned, that's the only attribute I will need to add. For the sake of our MVP though, I'm only going to just take the time to add in 4 options here. But if you wanted to add in a list of your own, I'd recommend just pausing the tutorial right now and extrapolating this list accordingly to the list of categories that you would also like to cater for. And now after we've added in our list of option sets, we can now move on to adding in the rest of the data types within our application. So this will be things like our user, our question, our answer, and so on. So let's jump into Bubble and open up our data types tab here, and we can start to add in all of the different data types within our database. So the first data type I'll be adding is our question. As I mentioned, every time someone creates a question, we're going to need to register that in our database. Then after our question, I'd like to add in an answer. And then for every answer, we were registering the answer content. So that is the actual text that should be connected to an answer. And then after that, I was registering a Quora space. So this is almost like a group, as I mentioned within Quora. And then of course, within every Quora space community, I would like to register a list of space posts. So I'll be calling this data type space post. I'll create that. And because I would like to split the content of every space post separately, just to maintain the speed of our application, I'll need to create another data type called space post content. So that is the content that will be linked back to our space post. And then finally, I would like to also allow users to create comments on every single space post. So I'll be calling this data type space post comment, and I will create that. And now after we've added in all of our different data types here, we can start to build out the data fields that lie within them. And you will also soon see how we can connect different data types together to cross-reference data within our application. So if I jump back into Notion here, I will start by adding in the list of data fields under our user data type. And so for every user account that is created within our application, I'd like to register some details about that person. So these are things like their name, their profile photo, and their bio. And these are all fields that I can easily add into Bubble. So I'm going to open up the Bubble tab again, and I will create a new data field under our user data type. And I'll be calling this field name. So this is obviously the name of the user. And this will just be a standard text field within our application. Then I would also like to register a profile photo for the user. And this field type will be an image. I'll choose to create that. Then I would like to register a bio for the user. So this is a short summary that we can display on their profile. This will also just be a text field. Then there will be the tagline for the user. And now on Quora, the tagline is something like the user's credentials or their education history that is often displayed next to their profile name. So when they answer a question, it could say something like their name followed by their tagline credentials. And that's just a small one-line text field. So of course the field type will be a text field. And now also in our user data type, I would like to identify a list of categories that this user is interested in. And this is where we can start to reference that list of option sets that I had previously created. So if we create a new field here, I'm going to call this interested categories. And I can see I've got a small typo there. But when we're selecting a field type for this, I'm going to scroll on down to the categories option, which was of course our list of option sets. And because a user can be interested in more than one category, I'm going to need to select that this is a field with multiple entries, meaning that it is a list. I can create that there. And then finally for our user data type, there's two last fields I'll need to add, and that is a list of all of the people that follow this user, as well as a list of all the people that this user follows. And this is a pretty common feature between social platforms these days, and it's also an easy feature to build within Bubble. For the data field though, I'm going to add in first of all the list of followers. So these are all the people that follow the current user. And now the way we'll be registering this is by selecting the field type to be a user, and we will also select that this is a list of multiple entries. And so essentially what this means is that every time someone follows a particular user, I will add them to a list of total users that also follow that person. And that will just allow us to keep a track of who actually follows the user and who doesn't. So I will choose to create that, and then I'll create another data field, and this will be called following. So this is a list of all the users that the current person who's logged in has selected to follow. And this once again will be a user data field type. And because a particular user can follow more than one person in an application at once, this of course will be a list with multiple entries. Then back in our Notion doc here, we can check off that we have finished adding in all the data fields for our user data type. And now we can scroll on down to our question and build out all the data fields that will sit within this. So the first data field I would like to add within our question here is a title. So this will be the actual name of the question itself. So this could be something like, how do you build an app with no code? So I'll be calling this field the title, and the field type will just be a simple text field. And then within this question, I would also like to add what's called a description. And this description will just be any more details that a user would like to add for the question. So normally on Quora, you'll find that there's obviously the title of the question itself. And then below that, there's a paragraph of text that just allows a user to build on their main question. And once again, I'll be selecting that this field type is a text field. I'll create that. And now whenever a question is created within our database, I'd also like the person who has submitted that question to link that to a list of categories within our option set list. And that way we can later on in our application, if we decide to filter out all the questions by their categories that also match a user's list of categories that they're interested in. So I'll be selecting to create a new field here, and I will be calling this categories. And once again, as I mentioned, we'll be referencing our categories option set. And because a particular question can belong to multiple categories, I'll be selecting that this field is a list with multiple entries. And then finally, the last two fields I would like to add to our question data type is both the upvotes and downvotes that will be registered for this particular query. So for every question, a user can obviously upvote or downvote that. That's a pretty common feature within Quora. So I'll be calling our first field upvotes. And now this field type will be a user field type, similar to the followers on our user data type. And this of course will be a list of users, because every time someone selects to upvote a question, I will add them to a list of total users who have also upvoted that question. And then of course at any time I can perform a count on how many users sit within that. And that's how we will determine how many people have actually upvoted that question. So I can choose to create that. And then the next field will of course be our downvotes, and this is the exact same. The field type is a user, and because multiple users can downvote a question, this will be a list with multiple entries. That's all I'll need to add for my question data type. So back in Notion, I'm going to check off all those data fields and then move along over to our answer data type. This one's pretty straightforward. So I'm going to jump into Bubble once again, open up our answer data type. And the first thing I would like to do within our answer is actually link this back to a question. So whenever a user is viewing a question that has been published by someone else, and they decide to take the time to add a response or an answer, When this is published within our application, I would like to link that answer back to the original question that a user has provided a response to. And this is also where you'll start to see the power of Bubble's custom database come into play, because at this point we can create a truly relational database where we're linking our answer data type to our question data type. So in order to do this, we'll be creating a new field, and I'll be calling this field the original question because we'll be linking back to a specific question. So the field name here will be called OG question. And for the field type, I would like to link this back to a question in our application. And because one answer will only be able to link to one question, I will not be selecting that this is a list of multiple entries. It will just be a single entry that we're connecting this to. And then also within our answers, I would like to create a list of upvotes and downvotes, because not only can users on Quora upvote and downvote questions, but they can also do the same for all answers that are submitted. So I'll be creating once again a field called upvotes. This will be the exact same as the previous field I had created, so it's a user field type, and of course multiple people can upvote a answer. And then it will be the exact same for our downvotes. So the field name will be called downvotes, and then this will be a list of users, and that's all we'll need to add in for our answer data type there. I'm going to jump into Notion and tick those off. The next field though is of course our answer content, and this will wrap up the process of creating all the data fields for our answers. So if we jump into Bubble again, we're going to open up our answer content here. And now every time an answer is created within our database, we also will need to create the answer content for it. So the answer content, as I had previously mentioned, is just the actual response that someone submits to an answer that of course will be linked back to a question. Now that might be a little confusing for you now, particularly if this is the first database you're setting up. But when I run you through that particular module in this tutorial, it will make a lot more sense to you. But similar to our initial answer data type, I'm going to want to link this answer content back to another data type. So as I mentioned, whenever an answer is published, I will need to link the answer content to it, just so we can reference the actual response only when it's needed. And then that will save us loading any unnecessary data when we don't need it within our application, because these are separate, which just means that it's going to help maintain the overall speed of our application in the long term. So I'm going to select to add a new field here, and this field will need to link back to our original answer. So I'll be calling this OG answer, and the field type here will be an answer, and I won't be selecting that this is a list of multiple entries, so I'll choose to create that. And then the other field I'll need to add is just the content itself. So this is the response of the actual answer. So I'll select that this is just a text field. I'll create that. And that's essentially all we will need to create for this data type. If you were really confused still at this point, you could of course just add this content field under the answer and not worry about splitting these data types. But what you'll find is that over the long term, your application will slow down, because every time it's trying to load a list of answers, it's going to be loading a ton of data, because all those text submissions can add up over time. So I definitely recommend splitting those out today, and that's why I've taken the time to explain this in as much detail as I possibly could. But now back in Notion, I can check off that I finished adding in our answer content. The next data type we will need to add in is the Quora spaces. So as I mentioned before, these are like the Facebook groups within Quora. They're just small communities where members can collaborate in. And because users can actually create Quora spaces themselves, I'm going to need to add in this data type and all its fields. So if I jump into Bubble here, select to open up my space data type. Every time a Quora space is created by a user, I'm going to need to register a couple of different fields. The first one is the name of the space. I will choose that that is just a text field. And then next I will need to register a description for the space. So this will just be like an overview of what this space is about. And then I would also like the user to register a photo for the space. So this is just a featured image for the community. And this of course will just be an image field type. And then finally, I'd like to register a list of all the users who are members of this space, and then also a list of all the users who are following this space. And now the difference between the two is that members of this space will have access later on in our build to actually publish and comment within this space, whereas those who are following it will only have access to view what's been published in the space, but they won't actually be able to contribute themselves. And so I'm going to create a field first of our members, and this will be a list of users. So I'll select that this field type should be a user and select that this is a list of multiple entries. So we can add multiple users to be contributors of this space. And then very much the same, we'll be recording a list of followers. So these are the people who follow the space but are unable to contribute to it. And this will once again be a list of users. And I'll be explaining how we can restrict access to both of these different users later on within our build today. But for now, that's all the data fields I'll need to add for our Quora spaces there. So I'll tick those off. We're almost finished making our way down the list, but the next data fields I'll need to add in is for our spaced posts. So within every Quora space, so every community, the members of that space can create posts. And every time a post is created, I'm going to need to add a title to it and of course link it back to the community that it's been published within. So over in Bubble, I'm going to open up our space post, and the first field I'd like to register is the title of the space. This one's pretty self-explanatory. This is just the name of the post that a user creates. And then the next thing I would like to do is register what particular community this post belongs to. So I need to link this space post back to a Quora space. So I'll be creating a new field here called OG space, and this data field will be linked back to a space, and only one post will link to one particular space at a time. So I won't be selecting that this is a field with multiple entries. And then the last two fields I'll need to register for our space posts is both a list of upvotes and a list of downvotes. So once again, users can choose to upvote and downvote each particular post. So I'll be creating a new field, and just like before, the upvotes will be a list of users, and every time someone adds an upvote, we'll be adding them to that list of users. And then downvotes is the exact same. This will be called downvotes, and it will be a list of users. Back in Notion then, I'm going to check off that I finished building out all these space post data fields. Once again though, I have separated the content for each post as a different data type. Because the actual content of each post can be quite long, I just didn't want to have to load all that data every time I was loading a list of posts within my application. And so this one is much the same as the answer content data type. I'm just going to need to register the actual content for it and then link it back to the post that it belongs to. So over in my bubble editor here, I'm going to open up the space post content. And so every time the content is created, I'm going to need to register the actual long form text or the content itself. So as I just explained, this will be a text field. And then I will also need to link this back to the post that it belongs to. So I'm going to be calling this original space post. And this field type will of course be a single space post. I will create that. And of course later on in our application, when we actually need to reference this feature, I'll be explaining how we can split these in more detail. But for now, that's all I'll need to create under our space post content. The last thing I will need to register is a comment for the space posts. And the reason this is separate from our space post data type is because, as I mentioned before, every time someone has the ability to create something within Bubble, it will need to be a data type. So users will be able to create posts, and they'll also be able to create comments that belong to those posts. So of course that means that within our comment here, I'm going to need to link this back to a post that it belongs to. And then I'll also just need to reference the content, so the text of that comment, and then also a list of upvotes and downvotes for every single comment. So if we jump into Bubble, open up our space post comment, I'm going to create a field here, And the first thing I'd like to do here is link this comment to the post that it has been published to. So I'll be calling this field OG space post because a comment will belong to a particular post within a space/community. And this field type will of course just be a space post. And because one comment will belong to one post, I won't be selecting that this is a field of multiple entries. And then within every comment, I'm going to need to register the actual content itself. So this is just the text of that comment. I'll select that this is a text field, create that. And then finally, users will also have the ability to upvote and downvote each individual comment. So once again, I'll be creating a list of upvotes, which is a list of users, and then also a list of downvotes, which of course is another list of users. So the field type will be a user, and I'll be selecting that this is a field with multiple entries. And that is the last set of data fields we'll need to add within our database. In comparison to some of my other builds, this is actually a pretty lofty database that we've had to create today. The main reason is because I've split most of our data types into 2 different entries. And as I mentioned, I know that can be quite confusing to you if you're new to Bubble, but in the long term, that will just allow us to maintain the speed of our application. So it is an essential thing to do from the beginning. But as you can see, it's never been easier to actually build your own custom database without even touching a single line of code. And that is by far one of my favorite features within Bubble. After building out our database, we can finally move along down to the list of features that I have laid out for us in our tutorial today. And you'll see that there are actually quite a few, but I've specifically broken these down into separate modules, just so I can focus on explaining these in as much detail as possible as we walk through our tutorial. The first feature I wanted to focus on today, though, is the ability to register new user accounts within our platform. Obviously, in order to make the platform functional to user accounts, we're going to need to first register those within our database. This feature is actually one of the easier ones that we're going to cover today. So let's just jump over into our Bubble editor and I can start showing you how this is done. Over in my editor here, I have a brand new canvas, and the first thing I'd like to do is actually create a separate page within our application where we can register new user accounts. So I'm going to head to the top drop-down menu here where I can view all of my pages within the editor, and I'll need to select to create a new page. I'll be calling this page the register page. I'll choose to create this. And now over on this page, the first thing that I always like to do is just update the background color of this to just be a light shade of gray. The reason being is that if I'm adding white input elements onto the page, I can sometimes lose track of where they lie in relation to the page borders. But by adding a gray background, I can now see where they sit on my page. Then once I've updated the color of this page, I'm going to start just laying in some input elements which will allow us to register a user's email, their password, their name, and also their categories of interest. So let's jump into this by selecting to add in a text element first onto the top of our page. Now this text element will just act as a heading on our page. So I'm just going to type in the static heading called register account. I will also then just update the style of this to be a H2 star font. Now throughout our tutorial today, I'm actually going to be focusing more on the workflows that power the app, not so much the design aspect of things. So I'm just going to be using, in this case, Bubble's default style heading here. But if you'd like to add your own custom heading here, I'd recommend just pausing the tutorial and editing the style of this yourself. But as I mentioned, I'm happy with the standard style of heading there. So I'm just going to close the width of this element and then center this horizontally within my page. Now I will duplicate this heading. I will move this over to the side and I'll update the static text to display the word name. And now below this, I would like to select from our input forms here and choose to add in just a standard input field. And as you probably guessed, we'll be using this input field to register the name of a new user when they're creating a new account. So I will update the title of this input to be called input name. And then I will just move that up a tad so it's closer to my heading and make sure that that heading is in line with the input field there. And then what I can do is also just move these over to the side so they're roughly in the center. And I will then copy both the heading and the input field there. I'll then just make sure these are both in line with the other heading and input field on my page. And in this case, I'm going to start by updating the name of this title here to display the word email. And then I'll also need to update the title of the input to be called input email. And obviously in this field, I'm going to be registering the user's email address, which means I'm going to also need to update the content format of this input to be an email. And this will just allow Bubble to actually validate any email address that is added into this, which just creates a richer experience for users when they want to register an account. Now, after adding this field, I'm going to copy this once more. I'll drag this down on my page. I will then update this heading to display the word password. And then I will, of course, update the name of this input field to be called input password. And once again, I will need to update the type of content format here to also be a password, which just means that it's going to hide whatever characters are added into this input field. And now finally below this, I'm going to copy just the heading here. I'll drag this down on my page. I apologize if these aren't really in line right now. I will tidy those up in a moment. But essentially, when a user registers an account, I would also like to register the categories that they're interested in. Because I could, if I want to, later on add some features that allows a user to only see a list of posts that are filtered by the categories that they're actually interested in. So what I'll be doing is just updating this static heading here to display the word categories of interest. I will need to drag this out so I can display the full heading. And now below this, I would like to display a list of categories that we stored within our option set list that a user can select from and store in their account. And now in order to allow a user to select from multiple categories, I'm going to need to add a special plugin to do this. So if we jump over to our plugins menu here and open up our plugin tab, we can open up the plugin library. And within the library, we'll need to search for the word multi. And the plugin I would like to install is the multi-select drop-down plugin, which is a free plugin by Bubble. We will choose to install that. And now I can close the plugin library, jump back over to my design tab. And if I scroll under my input forms here, I'll see that I have a new input element called the multi drop-down. And if I select to add in a multi drop-down menu, I can drag this onto my page. And now, as you can see, by default, it will allow us to display a list of static choices that a user can select from. But in the case of our tutorial today, I actually want to display all of the category choices that we've added to our list of option sets. So in order to do this, we will need to update the choices style here to be a list of dynamic choices, because we already have those choices stored within our option set list. And then what I'll need to do is update the type of choices so the element knows what type of data to actually display to the user. In this case, I want to select from our categories, which is of course linked to our option sets. And then I will need to identify which categories I would like to actually display. This is fairly straightforward because today I just want to select to display all of the categories within our option set list. And then finally, I just need to identify what actual text will display within those options. And in this case, I just want it to be the display of those option sets. So that will just be the name or the title of the option set. So that can be things like startups, tech, or marketing. It'll just be the word that we use to identify each option set choice. And now after I have configured the options that we'll be displaying within our multi-select dropdown here, I'm just going to need to update the name of this input to just be called multi-dropdown categories. And now while I'm here, I'm just going to straighten up all of these elements on my page, move my headings in line, make that in line with the other one, and also the same with that. And I will also drag our categories heading across, add the multi drop down so it's parallel with the others, and drag it all the way out there as well. And I'll just move that up a tad, or maybe we can just move that down. And then also add some additional space between our password input there. Perfect. I'm happy with how those are displayed. So now below all of our input fields, we can add in a button element and we can start to trigger our first workflow when that button is clicked, in which case we'd like to create a workflow that registers a new user's account. So let's scroll on up to our visual elements on our left-hand tab here, and then select to add in a button element. We'll drag that out. And now with our button element, I'm going to update the text here to display the word register. And then I will in fact just update the style of this button today, just so the branding is similar to the Quora platform itself. So I'm going to select the edit button here, and this will allow us to edit the style of this button. The only two things I want to change is first of all the color of the button. I have a red color code here, or I guess maroon color code that I would like to add in, which is the same color code that Quora uses. If you'd like that, the color code is 97231F. And then the other thing I'll be doing to change the style of this button is just updating the roundness of this to be 20, just so the edges of the button are curved. I can then jump back into my design tab here and see that that has updated the style correctly. I can choose to center this horizontally in my page. And now I can select the Start Edit Workflow so we can create the first workflow when this button is clicked. Over in my workflow editor here, this is a fairly straightforward workflow to create. I'm going to select to add our first action. And in this case, I want to sign the user up to our platform. So I'll select from our account option here, select to sign the user up. And then within this workflow, I will need to match the input fields on our page with the input fields within our bubble editor here. So of course, whenever a user registers an account, they'll need an email and a password, which will be used to log in when they return to your application. So I'll start to match the email field that will be stored within our database with the input email field on our page. I will select to store its value, and then I'll do the exact same for our password. So for our password field here, I will select to store the value of the input password on our page. And now what I love about this workflow event is that we can also update any other fields we would like for this user's account at this point in time. And I can easily do this by selecting the Change Additional Field button here. And this just allows me to update all of the other data fields that I'm storing within a user's account. Now for our tutorial at this point in time, I'm obviously going to want to register the user's name because that is an input field that I'm storing on my page. So I will select that the name of the user will now equal the value of the input name on our page. And then finally, the only other field I'd like to change right now at this point in time is the interested categories of this user. In this case, I want to add to it all of the categories that a user has chosen from our multi-select dropdown. So in order to add all of those categories, I'm going to need to select to add a list. And now the reason I'm choosing to add a list is because I want to add all of the categories that are currently selected, not just a single category. So I'll select to add a list, and this list will of course be the value that's stored in our multi dropdown categories option. And that is all we will need to do in order to register a new user's account within our database. Before we take a preview at what this experience looks like within our editor though, I do just want to add an initial step to our workflow here. So as it stands within my app, a user would land on this page, they would register their account, that workflow would run, and then nothing would actually happen. In the case of our app though, I'd like to create an experience that not only registers a user account, but then redirects them through to a settings page in our app where they can update the rest of their account information. And this is a fairly straightforward process to create. First, I'm going to need to create a separate page within my application, and I can do this within my workflow editor. So if I jump over to the workflow tab here, I will open up our workflow that we had currently just created where we were registering a user's account. And now I would like to add another step to this workflow. And I'd like to choose from the navigation event because I'll be sending a user to another page. And I'll be selecting the Go to Page option. Now, as I mentioned, the destination page that we'll be sending the user to, which will be our settings page, doesn't yet exist at this point in time. So we can easily create this by selecting the Create a Page option. And the page name here will just be called Settings. I'll choose to create this. And now you'll see under our drop down menu here that the settings page is a new option. And now within this workflow, we won't need to send any data through to this page. I will be explaining later on in our tutorial where there will be instances in which we will need to do that. But that is all I will need to create for our initial registration experience here. Let's jump on over to our Bubble development environment and just take a preview at what this whole experience looks like. Over in my Bubble editor here, I'm on my registration page. I'm going to start by adding in my name. I will add in an email address. I'll add in a password as well. And then for our categories of interest, I can select to choose the categories from our option set list that I'm interested in. Let's say marketing, startups, and tech. I will then select to register an account. That workflow will run. And now we're being redirected through to our settings page here, which of course is a blank page right now. But that just gives you an overview of what this whole experience will look like. Back in my Notion doc, I'm going to check off that I finished building a feature to register a user's account within our platform, which throughout this process, I covered how we could add the multi-drop-down plugin to register the interested categories of a user, and then also how I added that initial step to our workflow that redirected us through to our settings page after the user's account was created. The next feature that I want to build out in our tutorial is creating a home page that allows us to not only display a list of all the recently published questions across the Quora platform, but it will also include a list of all of the Quora spaces that a user could potentially follow, as well as a search function that allows a user to search for questions across the application. There's a little bit involved in this particular feature, so let's just jump right into our Bubble editor and we can get started. Over in my editor here, I'm going to select from our page drop-down menu and choose to create a new page. I'll of course be calling this page the home page. I'll choose to create that. And now the first thing I'll be doing on this page, like I always do, is just updating the background color to be a light shade of gray. And then the first feature I'll be adding onto the page is a list of all the recently published questions across the Quora platform. So in order to do this, I'm going to need to scroll on down under our containers menu here and choose to add in our repeating group element. Now, if you're not familiar with repeating groups yet, they're a powerful element that allows you to display a list of information stored within your database. So in our application today, I'll be using this repeating group to display a list of all the questions that have been published to our application. But before I explain how we can actually display content within this repeating group, I'm going to need to update the type of content that I'd like to display within these cells. So essentially, I'd like our repeating group here to display a list of questions from our database. And then I will need to add a data source so the Bubble editor knows which particular questions I'd like to display. So I'm going to need to perform a search through our database for all of the questions. And in this case, I'll be searching for all of the questions in our database. So I won't need to add any constraints here to refine the particular questions that I'd like to show. But one thing I would like to do is sort these by their created date. And I'd like to display the most recent questions at the top of this repeating group. So I will select that the descending order should be yes. I can then close the data source of our repeating group and then update the layout style. In this case, I'll be choosing from the extended vertical scrolling option, which just means that the number of rows will expand or retract based on how many questions we'll be displaying. And if a user continually scrolls down the page, the Bubble editor will then load more rows from our database. I will also update the default number of rows to be 2. So when the page is loaded, we'll only be displaying 2 questions until a user scrolls down the page, and then more questions will be loaded and displayed. And now that we've configured our data source for our repeating group, we can start adding in the elements we'd like to display for our repeating group. And what I love about this element is that you only need to add in the elements into the top row, and it will duplicate those across the remaining rows. So I'm going to start by adding in a picture, and in this case I would like to display the profile photo of the person who's asked a question. So I'm going to select from our image element here, I'll drag that out. And what I'd like to do is choose to insert dynamic data, and I'd like to display the current cell's question. So the current cell is the particular question within this row. I would like to search for the creator who published this question, and I'd like to display their profile photo. While I'm here, I will also just take the time to quickly add a custom style to this photo, because instead of just displaying a square image, I wouldn't mind having this image formatted as a circle. So I'll just choose to create a new style, and I'll call this circle image. I'll create this. I'll then edit the style, and the only thing I'll be updating is the roundness of the image, and I'll just be updating that to be 100. I'll then jump back to our design tab, and you'll soon see that the dimensions of that are now a circle. I will then just update the width of this to be 55, and then the height of that to also be 55. And I can move that up just into the corner of my repeating group there. Now beside this, what I'd like to do is display the name of the user who has published this question as well. So I'll select to add in a text element. I'll drag this out next to our image there. I'll insert dynamic data and choose to display the current cell's question, the creator of that question who is a user, and I'd like to display their name. I will also bold this text so it stands out. So I'll select to open up our rich text editor here. I will highlight all of this text and I'll select the bold option. I can save that, and you'll see that that's now updated the format of that text. I'll also just close off the height of that element there. And then below this, I'd like to add in another text element, and in this case, I'll be displaying the date that this question was published on. So I'll choose to insert dynamic data and display the current cell's question. And if I scroll on down, you'll see the option here that's called creation date. So this will identify what date that question was published on. And then I would also just like to select to format this as a custom format. And I'm going to select the option here which displays the month as text, then the date followed by the year. I can choose to close that. I'll then just make sure this element is in line with the user's name for this question. I'll close off the height of that, and also just drag this out so it's the same width as the name text field there. And now below this, what I'd like to do is just display the title of the question. So I'll select to add in another text element. I'll drag that out, and in this case I'll insert dynamic data and display the current cell's question, its title, and in this case I'm also going to update the style of this to be a H2 style heading, because this is the main feature of this repeating group here. I'll just drag that out so it's in line with our profile photo there. I'll reduce the height of that element and drag this all the way across our repeating group. And below this heading, I'll be adding in just a preview of the text that's added to the description of this question. So I'll select to add yet another text element in. And then for this text element, I'd like to insert dynamic data and display the current cell's question, its description. Only I would like to cut this description off at 100 characters. So because this description could be quite long depending on what type of question a user is asking, I obviously won't want to display the full description itself within each row. Instead, I would like to only display a preview of that text, which would of course encourage a user to then click through to the actual question where they can view the full text of it. So in order to cut the text off at 100 characters, after I've identified that I want to display the current cell's question's description, I can scroll on down to the option called truncated to, and then I can just type in the number 100. So now this will truncate that text, which just means it will cut it off at 100 characters. And once I've truncated this text, I can then move this element in line with our heading, reduce the total height of it, and stretch this out to be in line with the rest of our elements here. And then finally within our repeating group cell here, I would like to add in a function that allows a user to upvote, downvote, and view the number of all the answers that have been added to this question. And in order to do this, I'll select to add in an icon element under our visual elements tab here. I'll drag this out, and then I will search for the word up, and then I will select this arrow icon here, And I will update the name of this to be called icon upvote. I can also just make that a tad smaller. And now beside this, I'll be adding in some text that will display the number of upvotes that this question has. So I can select to add in a text element beside this. It will only need to be small because it's just going to be a number. And then in this case, what I'd like to do is insert dynamic data and display the current sales question, its upvotes, which if you remember is a list of users. So essentially every time a user selects to upvote a post, I will add their profile to the list of total users who have also upvoted this post. And then what I can do is perform a count on that list, and it will display a number of how many users in total have upvoted this question. So I'd like to select the count option here. So that will display the current sales questions upvotes and perform a count on that. I can then copy both the icon and the text element, drag these out to the right. If I really wanted, I could even reduce the size of the text element for our upvote count because, as I said, it's only going to be a number with a couple of digits. It's not going to be a long form text element like our question title. But now what I'll do with our duplicated upvote icon and then the dynamic text next to it is choose to update the actual icon I'm displaying here. And in this case, I'm going to type in the word down, and I'm going to choose the opposite icon, which is a down arrow. And of course, I'll need to update the icon name to be called icon downvote. And then for our text element here, I'm going to just update the upvotes text. So I'm going to select that. And in this case, I'm just going to select the downvotes option because I'd like to perform a count on the current sales questions total number of downvotes. And then finally beside this, I'm going to copy these elements once again, drag those out to the right. I could close off the width of that text element, move those down. And now what I'd like to do is just display a count of how many answers have been added to this question. So I'll be updating the icon here. I'm going to search for the word comment. I can select the comment icon here. And for the text element beside this, I'm going to need to backspace all of the dynamic data I previously added in. And what I'll need to do is search for the total number of answers that have been added to this question and then perform a count on that. So because our answers are a different data type from our question, I'll need to perform a search in our database for all of the answers where the original question, so the OG question, equals the current sales question. So the current sales question is the question within this row of our repeating group here. And then once I've identified that I want to search for all the answers that belong to this question here, I would like to perform a count on that. So I can count how many answers have in fact been added to this question. And that is all I'll need to add within our repeating group here. Above this though, what I would like to do is add in the ability for a user to publish a question. And I'll be covering how we can build out the workflow for that in a separate module. But for now, what I'd like to do is just build out the user interface that allows a user to select that option. So before I do this, I'm going to drag my page down. I will just center my repeating group horizontally in the page. Also just move this down the page. And above this, I'll be adding in a group element. So if I scroll on down to my containers menu here, I'll select to add in a group. While I'm working with this group, what I'll also do is update the style of this to be the group border, just so it has a white background so I can see where it sits on our page. And I would like the group here to be the same width as our repeating group below it. So I'm just going to select our repeating group. I can see that the width is 561 pixels. So I'll update the width of this group to also be 561 pixels. And then I'll just make sure that this is in fact in line with our repeating group there. And I'll be calling this group ask question. And the reason I'm adding a group element here is because once I add in multiple elements into this group, this overall group will act as a container. So if a user clicks anywhere within this group, we can trigger a workflow, which in the case of a user asking a question, I would then display a pop-up that allows them to fill in some input fields and then publish that question accordingly. So within our group, what I'll be doing is selecting to add in a picture of the user, their name, and then a title, which just encourages them to ask a question. So in order to add in a picture element, I'm going to make this simple and just copy the profile photo picture I already have in our repeating group. I'm going to then click on our group and choose to paste that in. I can move this across there, and of course I will just need to update the dynamic text here. I'm going to backspace all of the dynamic data I've added, and I will need to select to insert dynamic data, and in this case I just like to display the current user, their profile photo. So the current user is the person who's logged in right now on their homepage and is looking at a list of questions. And then beside this, I would like to display the current user's name. So I will add a text element in. I'll choose to insert dynamic data and display the current user's name. I'll just move this across from our profile photo a tad there and make sure it's roughly centered in line with our profile photo. And then I can just drag this group down a tad, and I'll add in another text element, and this will just be a static text element that displays what is your question. I will update this to be a H2 style heading, and I'll drag this in line with our picture element there. And then I will move this whole group down our page, and as you can see, when I move the group, because it is a container, it will move all of the elements that sit within it. And I'll just make sure it's not touching my repeating group there. That's fine. But above this group now, what I'd like to do is create a search experience that allows a user to search through our application for a list of existing questions. This is a fairly straightforward process to do. If I scroll on down under my input forms here, I can select to add in a search box element, not an input element. I'll drag this out on our page, and I will start by updating the placeholder text here. So the placeholder text is just a default string of text that displays until a user actually clicks into this element. And I will update this to display the words search questions, ... I could even drag that out a little further if I would like, and just make sure it's in line with our group element. And now what I love about the search box element in Bubble is that it allows you to search through a list of anything stored within your database. So for the case of our Quora clone today, I'm going to be searching through a list of all the questions that have been submitted to our database. And when a user actually begins to type in a question that they would search for, we can start to display some predictive suggestions that match the user's search query. So I'm going to leave these search choices here as a list of dynamic choices. Of course, I will just need to define what type of data I would like to display within the search box. So if I select to define a list of options, I'm going to search through all the questions in my database. And then I would like to identify what specific field of those questions I will be searching through. In this case, it's just going to be the title of the question. So if a user starts to type in a particular query, I'm going to show a list of results based on the title that matches the query within the search box. And now once I've defined what type of data I would like to search within this field here, I can create a workflow that now redirects a user through to the full question page once they've searched for a question that they would like to know some answers for. So in order to do this, I'm going to jump over to our workflow tab here, and I'll be creating our first workflow on our home page. In this case, I'm going to select the trigger from our workflow to be from our Elements tab here, and the trigger will identify when the value of an input has been changed. By default, it will select our search box input, which is the exact input that I would like. And in this case, I want to create an event that redirects a user through to the full question page and sends through the value of the question that a user has selected from our search box. So I'll be selecting to add a new action. Because we're redirecting a user, I'll need to choose from the navigation menu here and select the Go to Page option. And then within this workflow, the destination page doesn't yet exist, so I'll select to create a new page. I'll be calling this the question page. I'll create that. And now before I select that as our destination page, I'm going to need to head over to that page and make one quick change. So if I jump to my page drop-down menu here, select to open up our question page. I'll open up the design tab and double click on the actual page itself here. One thing I would just like to note before we complete that step in our workflow is that I'll need to update a type of content on this page. So because I want to display some dynamic information on this page, which of course identifies the full title of a question, the description, and then any comments associated with this question, I'm going to need to update the type of content of this page to also be a question. And within Bubble, this will just allow us to send the data of a question through to this page, so that way it knows which particular question to display to an end user. Now, in a later module throughout this tutorial, of course, I'll be explaining how we can design this page to display the dynamic information of a specific question. But for now, I'm just going to need to update the type of content to be a question. I can then jump back into my home page, open up our workflow editor, select to open the workflow that we were just editing, and then I can now select the destination page to be the question page. And you'll see here that now, because we have a type of content stored on that page, I'll be required to send some data through to that page. And the data I would like to send through is the value of the search box. So essentially, because the search box is displaying a list of relevant questions to a user search query, I can send through the value of the final question that they decide to click on through to our question page. That is all we'll need to create for this workflow here. Of course, I'll be showing you a preview of that in a moment. But if I jump back onto my home page here, what I would also like to do is create a workflow when the question's title is selected from our repeating group here. And essentially what I'd like to create is a workflow that redirects a user through to our question page whenever a title of a question is clicked. So I'll choose to start edit a workflow when the title of this repeating group's question is selected. Within this workflow, I'll once again be choosing from a navigation event. I'll select the go to page option. The destination page will be our question page, and the data I'd like to send through is the current sales question. So that is the current row within our repeating group that a user is selecting from. Now, if I jump back on my home page, I can continue designing the rest of the elements I'd like to add here. I'm going to scroll on up next and add in a button element to the top right hand corner of our page here. And this button element will just display the text add question. I'll also just make sure it's the same height as our search box element beside it. I might also just reduce the width of it. I'm not going to create a workflow yet for this button. I'll explain that when I run you through the process of actually creating a question in our database. But I just wanted to add that now while we're formatting the user interface of our home page. While I'm here, I could also add in an image element to the top left-hand corner of our page. And in this case, what I'd like to do is add the Quora logo on our page. So instead of adding in a dynamic image, I'm just going to upload a static image of the Quora logo that I have saved on my local device. And once that's uploaded, I might just reduce the size of that and make sure it's in line with the rest of our elements there. And then the final elements I'd like to add onto our page is just displaying a list of the spaces that a user currently follows, and then a list of suggested spaces that a user doesn't follow. So I'm going to select our page here, and I'm just going to drag out the width of this a tad. I will do the same on the other side. And now what I'd like to do is choose to add in a repeating group element to the left-hand side of our page here. And essentially within this repeating group, I'll be displaying a list of all the Quora spaces that a user currently follows. And then I'll be creating a navigation event within these spaces that sends the user through to that space page once they click on that option. So I'll need to update the type of content of our repeating group first to be a space. And then I'll need to add a data source, of course. So I'll be searching through our database, identifying all the spaces. In this case though, I'd like to add a constraint because I only want to display the spaces that the current user, so the person who's logged in, already follows. So I'll be selecting to display only those spaces where the followers, which is a list of users, contains the current user, so the person who's logged in. I will then also update the layout style to be extended vertical scrolling, the number of rows to be 3, And then within our repeating group cells here, I'm going to add just two simple elements. The first will just be a square image, and this will just be the image that's associated with this space. So I'll insert dynamic data and display the current cell space, its photo. I'll scroll on down and also just make sure that this element is square. So I will just set the width as 45 and then the height as 45, and then move that up into the corner of our repeating group. I could also just extend the width of our repeating group and move that across. And then beside this image element, I would like to display the name of the space. So I can choose to insert dynamic data and display the current cell space's name. I'll obviously just need to make that text bigger so it can actually be displayed. And again, I'm just going to expand the width of this repeating group and expand the width of the text element there. I can also then just move these down a tad, move the text up so it's roughly centered with our photo here, and then just close off the empty space at the bottom of our repeating group. Perfect. And now what I'd like to do is create a redirect when the text element of the space's name is clicked, and I'll be sending the user through to that particular space's page in our application. So if I select to start edit a workflow here, I'm going to choose to create another navigation event. I'll select the go to page option. The destination page currently doesn't exist, so I'll need to create a new one. And I'll be calling this the space page. I'll create that. And of course, because I'd like to send through some data of a particular Quora space, I'm going to need to set a content format type on that destination page. So if I jump over to our page drop-down menu, I can select to open up our space page here. I'll just jump over to the design tab now. And then within this, I can update the type of content to be a space. So that way I can dynamically send through a space and display all of its information on this page. Then if I jump back over to my home page, I can open up our workflow editor and open up the workflow when the text, which is space, is clicked. I will then select the destination page to be our space page, and the data I'll be sending through is the current cell space. Back in my design tab then, I'm just going to move this repeating group down a tad, and above this I'm going to add in another group element which will be used to trigger a pop-up that allows a user to create a new Quora space. So I'm going to scroll on down, select from our containers menu, add in a group up the top here. I'll just update the default style to be the group border so I can see where it actually sits on our page. I'll also just make it the same width as our repeating group below it so I can see it's 222 pixels. I will also update this to be 222 pixels. We'll drag that out so it's in line with our repeating group, and it's also in line with our initial group here where the user can ask a question. And I'll just move our repeating group up a tad. And now within this, what I'd like to do is add in an icon, drag that out, and I'll just search for a plus icon here. I'll move that over to the side of our group. And then finally, I'll add in a text element. And this will just be a static text element that displays the word create a space. And I'll just move that so it's roughly in the center next to our plus icon there. And this will essentially be used as a button element when a user would like to create a new space at a later point in time. I won't be covering that now, but I will be explaining that in full detail later on in a separate module. But the last thing I'd like to do to this page is just copy this repeating group here, which is the list of spaces that a user currently follows. And then I would like to paste another version of it on our page, but drag this out to the right-hand side of our page. I will make sure it's in line with our existing repeating group there and our button element. And within this repeating group, I will just need to update the data source for these spaces, because instead of displaying a list of spaces that a user currently follows, I'd like to provide a user with a list of suggested spaces that they currently don't follow. So all I'll need to do is update the data source here and choose to delete the existing constraint. So at the moment it's searching for all the spaces, but I'll need to add a constraint and display only those spaces where the followers, doesn't contain the current user. And that is all I'll need to change within this repeating group. Of course, I will just need to create another workflow when this particular spaces text is clicked, because once again, I'd like to redirect the user through to this spaces page. So I'll select to start edit a workflow, and much the same as our previous workflow, I'm going to select from a navigation event, select the go to page option. I'll be sending the user through to our space page and sending the data of the current cell space with it. And then finally, back on our design tab, I'm going to add in a text element here. And this is just going to be a static heading that just says spaces to follow. I'll also just open up the rich text editor, highlight the text and choose to bold that. And then I can close off the height of that element. And I could even just move this up on our page there as well. And that is all I'll actually need to create on our homepage here. As you can see, it's come together quite nicely. And we've already started building out some of the workflows that make this page functional. I won't actually be able to show you a preview at this specific point in time, just because we currently haven't built the workflows to create a question, which of course will populate our page with data. But if I open up my Notion doc over here, I can check off that I finished building out our homepage, which of course entailed displaying a list of previous questions that have been published to our platform. It also included a search function that could redirect a user through to a question page based on a query that they are typing in. And then I've displayed a list of spaces that a user follows, as well as a list of the Quora spaces that a user doesn't follow. And then, of course, as I mentioned, I had created some workflows that redirects a user through to the full question page. And that is all I have time for in this tutorial today. If you are interested in checking out the rest of the course, I'd recommend clicking the link in the description to purchase the full course. Within the complete course, I'll be walking you through the step-by-step instructions to complete the rest of our build. You can also get access to a suite of Bubble tutorials where you'll learn how to build other popular products. If you'd like to get started building some other popular products for free, I'll be sure to include some suggested links at the end of this video. Thanks again for taking the time to watch, and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you'd like to see any other useful tutorials to help you on your Bubble journey.